Forgotten Realms, Realms of Valor. The Lord of Lowhill, Douglas Niles. Paldo emerged from his burrow to bask in the air of a rare summer moon. Not too hot, neither windy nor cloudy, with just a kiss of warm breeze to carry the scent of ripening grapes and lush, well-watered pastures. A mile away, the waters of Corwell Firth gleamed in the sunlight. The barely rippled surface cast a million diamond spots of reflection between circling arms of verdant land. A stout halfling stood before his sturdy whitewashed wooden dwelling. In typical halfling fashion, it was buried halfway into a grassy hillside, but the burrow was unquestionably the largest house in Lowhill. The air of affluence extended to the occupant of the burrow as well. Paldo's long hair, slightly grey, curled below his ears and just touched the edge of his elegant silken collar. Even this early in the day he wore well-tailored, expensive clothing. Any observer would know immediately that he was a halfling who knew the finer things in life. Below and beyond a stretch of lush pastureland, nestled against its sheltered harbour, Corwell town awakened to the business-like bustle of the folk going about their human activities. The currows of fishers already bobbed beyond the breakwater, while the clanging of hammer and tongs told of an early rising blacksmith tending his forge. Carts of fresh produce and milk, some drawn by small ponies and others by long-legged shaggy hounds, rumbled into Corwell through its open gates. High on the knoll overlooking the town, Paldo saw the squat form of Caer Corwell, the wooden-walled fort that served as home to Earl Randolph, and for those weeks when Tristan and Robin visited, as the summer quarters of the High King and Queen themselves. He thought of his good friends with a flash of pleasant anticipation, remembering that in a little less than a fortnight the royal family would return to Corwell for their summer holiday. Finally, the stocky halfling's eyes drifted closer to home, to the cozy warren of cottages and burrows built around this small rounded hill. Barely a mile removed from Corwell town, Lowhill provided a pastoral setting for the little halfling community of which Paldo served as an honorary Lord Mayor. Nearby bloomed the lush vineyards, and to those fertile hedges Paldo now sauntered, inspecting with pleasure the clumps of unripened grapes growing plump and sweet in the sun. To his bare feet, covered on the tops with a coat of silky hair, the grass felt soft, cool, and inviting. Pleasantly reminded of the many good wines he'd sampled from these very vines, he settled himself to a comfortable seat on a patch of shady grass. "I'll have to cart a load of last year's vintage over to King's Bay," Paldo reflected. The prospect of that trip interested him in a lackadaisical sort of way. He wouldn't go today or tomorrow, and probably not the day after that either, but it was something to think about. In fact, he remembered a cute little barmaid there, a cherubic-faced halfling wench with whom he could certainly strike a profitable deal. Indeed, if she remained as friendly as he remembered, he would be strongly tempted to while away a few days in the pleasant fishing town. Not too long, he reminded himself, since the King and Queen will arrive in Corwell for the midsummer holiday, and I'll have to be home by then. After all, this was not just any summer holiday. This marked the 10th year of Tristan's reign and the 10th year of his marriage to Robin. All in all, the occasion called for some kind of appropriate acknowledgement. At this thought, the halfling's round-cheeked face darkened in a momentary scowl. He wanted to give them a wondrous gift, something appropriate to the grand occasion. Yet, whatever his gift to the royal couple would be, Paldo doubted that he could find something sufficiently unique or fabulous in either Corwell or King's Bay. What to do? This question had nagged at him off and on for the last several weeks, yet the stout halfling had not let his lack of solutions cause him undue distress. Sooner or later, something would come up. Of course, he could have sailed for the Sword Coast when he first faced the problem. He would be on his way back by now, with some fabulous and rare token of his friendship and respect. Yet such decisive action was not the halfling's way, and now, of course, he didn't have enough time to make the trip and still return for the festival. Mildly irritated with the calendar, not himself, Paldo shook away the concern and continued his inspection of the islets. "Lord Mayor! Lord Paldo!" The high voice came to his ears from beyond the hedges, a young halfling, male by the sound of it. "Over here," Paldo replied, sitting up with a grunt of annoyance. He climbed to his feet slowly, aware that he no longer moved as nimbly as he had a decade or so before. Peering over the nearby hedge, he looked to see who had disturbed his meditations. A red-haired halfling skidded to a stop before Paldo and hastily doffed his cap. Cheeks glowing from exertion, shoulders bouncing as he struggled to regain his breath, the stranger could only pant for a moment as the Lord Mayor looked him over. The young halfling was a harefoot, not quite an adult, dressed in plain country garb and carrying a satchel over his shoulder. The newcomer smiled in a hopeful sort of way, wiping the sweat from his brow with his free hand. True to the harefoot tradition, he wore no shoes. "What is it?" Paldo inquired, suspecting that his quiet morning would remain so no longer. In spite of himself, Paldo felt a measure of curiosity. "Cowford, the barrel maker, told me that I'd find you here," said the young halfling, still panting. "As you did. And who might you be?" "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." The youth looked chagrined. "I'm Stefanik of Leyrath Downs," he explained hastily. Paldo knew that community of Harefeet, which was located several days' travel to the east, in the fringes of Leyrath Forest. "And well, I found this, and I didn't know where else to take it. I mean, every halfling on Gwyneth knows about you and your adventures. Why, if it wasn't for you, the Darkstalker would have—" "Enough!" cried Paldo, raising both his hands in mock surrender. "Tales have a way of being exaggerated, though I did play a small role in the defeat of that menace. In fact, there's a certain element of truth." He shook his head, forcing away the pleasant wave of nostalgia. "But enough of that. You have something to show me, it would seem?" "Oh, yes." The halfling thrust a satchel still unopened toward Paldo. "Here." "What is it? Where did it come from? How did it get to the forest?" "Right now you've got about 10 questions for each of my answers," the mayor chuckled, taking the leather sack. It proved to be surprisingly heavy, containing a large object made of metal and a lot of it. "Let's see what you've got." Paldo casually stretched the mouth of the satchel wide, but when he looked inside he could not suppress a gasp of astonishment. Shiny metal gleamed even in the shadowy confines of the leather pouch, too pure for the silver it must be, or platinum. He reached for the item's blunt rounded end, allowing the satchel to fall to the ground and reveal a long-bladed dagger. The Lord Mayor held the weapon by the hilt, thinking that it was much too heavy to be an effective weapon. Yet that hardly mattered, sunlight reflecting in dazzling patterns from the gleaming surface, twinkling in brilliant colors where it struck the facets of a multiple of gems. A straight blade, sharpened on both sides, extended nearly a foot from the impractical jewel-encrusted hilt. "I know you've traded all sorts of things, rare weapons and treasures," Stephanie continued breathlessly. "You've been to Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate and lots of places. I bet more than any other halfling in the Moonshades. Why, even in Leyrath Downs, we've heard now that you rescued the king from the Firbolg giant kid. When I tried to think of who could have answered my questions, well, there was just no one else who would even come close. "Aye," whispered Paldo, too overcome by the object's splendor to even acknowledge the praise. "Some kind of a thief's dagger," Paldo observed with a silent whistle. "It's a blade of little utility, but truly exceptional worth. Quickly, lad, where did you find this?" "In the forest, Larath Forest," stammered Tefnik. "I was hunting well into the woods. I found the dagger at a place I camped, where two streams flow together. It was lying there beside the stream, just like this, so shiny I couldn't possibly have missed it." He noticed Paldo's scowl of concentration. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, not that I can see." Paldo couldn't take his eyes from the silvery surface. He identified the gems here as a plump ruby on each handguard, there an array of emeralds around the base of the hilt, in the middle of the hand grip a huge diamond. With difficulty he kept his hands from trembling. Never had he held an object of such worth, such splendor. "So it looked like it hadn't been there long?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. "No, but that's the funny thing, since no one there had been before me, at least, not for a long time. I'm a pretty fair tracker," Stefanik added with a bucolic honesty. "I would have known." The Lord Mayor turned the dagger over in his hands, examining the blade. Platinum there, too, polished, and honed to the sharpness of a razor. Then a small imperfection caught his eye, near where the blade met the hilt. Raising the knife so that full sunlight fell on the blemish, he looked closely and felt a sudden chill of apprehension. The image was no flaw in the polished surface. It was a tiny etching of leering, fleshless skull. "What is it?" asked the youngster, following Paldo's gaze. He gulped audibly when he got a close look. "I never noticed that before. What does it mean? A skull?" "You say you found this in the depths of Larath Forest?" Paldo inquired meaningfully. "Yes, but I don't—" Stefanik stopped abruptly, his face blanching, his eyes growing to saucers in sudden suspicion. "The Palace of Skulls?" he whispered. "It's one explanation, the only one," Paldo concluded grimly. "It's supposed to appear in Larath Forest only once a generation, and then only for the waxing of the summer solstice moon." "The new moon was but 4 days past," Stefanik said, his tone full of wonder. "And the knife, when did you find it?" Paldo pressed. 3 days ago," the younger halfling exclaimed with a shudder. Then he squinted, a surprisingly mature skepticism appearing in his expression. "But I thought the tales of skull fortresses were just legends. Sure, my grandmother used to frighten us with stories of evil Prince Kurtheril and his curse, but now that I'm grown up, I can't take them seriously." "Can't you?" inquired the mayor of Lohiel archly. "Don't you think there might be some basis to the tales?" Again Stefanik suppressed a shudder. "I know the stories that Kathril still dwells there, but he is no longer a man. Just some kind of shadow that can suck the soul and life right out of you." "What about the other stories?" Paldo grew increasingly excited as he considered the possibilities. "Tales of treasure beyond your wildest dreams, mountains of wealth, glory such as you've never seen, all there for the taking, but only until the rising of the full moon." "You mean treasures like this?" Stefanik asked, his eyes dropping to the dagger. "You think the dagger comes from the Palace of Skulls?" "Ouch," Paldo declared, abruptly dropping the weapon and blowing on his palm. "It got hot." "Look," hissed Stefanik, pointing to the dagger as it twisted on the ground. The blade had fallen on its tip, and for a second it wavered back and forth, as if it might stick into the ground. Then it bounced into the air, flopped onto its side, and flipped around so that the blade pointed just a little south of due east. The platinum surface glowed with a brightness greater than the sun's reflection. "It's It's like it heard me, Stefanik said softly. As soon as I said the name of the place, it heated up. And look at the way it's pointing, Paldo said. The glow subsided and he reached out to touch the weapon's already cooling hilt. Straight into Loreth Forest. Can it be from that place? Like I said, it's the only explanation. Paldo's mind worked furiously. The fortress meant treasure beyond belief, and that might mean a suitable present for the king and queen. Can you find your campsite again? Of course, Stefanik proclaimed. I'm a good scout too. I know the woods like the inside of my burrow. Splendid. Let's see. We'll need some supplies and a couple of ponies. It'll take me a few hours to get ready. You can rest up at my house and we can leave in the afternoon. His estimate proved conservative. In actuality, the two halflings rode down the King's Road sometime before lunch, a fact that the road-weary Stefanik regretted, but was too timid to mention. They spent the night at a comfortable inn in Kentrev Court and made such good time the next day that by early evening Stefanik led them southward from the road until they reached the very fringe of the forest there. Amid a sparse scattered well-dried fir trees, they found a grassy meadow for their camp. During their journey, Paldo found himself developing an avuncular affection for the young halfling. Stefanik's blatant hero worship did nothing to impair the relationship, and the Lord Mayor's restrained silence only served to inflate the youngster's somewhat exaggerated assessment of his skills and exploits. As twilight fell on their little camp, they passed some time in more serious conversation, comparing the tales they'd heard from the Palace of Skulls. Among the folk of the Moonshaes and their halfling neighbors, the place was common setting for tales of heroism, though few believed that it really existed. Paldo found that the version of the legend told in the village of Lareth Downs differed somewhat from the stories he'd heard somewhere in the Moonshaes. Yet, since that little village of halflings was nearer to the ancient structure's reputed location, he placed strong credence in that folklore. Lareth Downs, Paldo remarked as he settled down near the crackling embers of their fire. There aren't many who live there, true? Stefanik shrugged. Until I saw a great city named Lowhill, I would have disagreed with you. But truth be told, we are but a dozen families scattered over a little hilltop. Paldo suppressed a smile. The great city of Lowhill, indeed. You live in the forest proper? He asked. Only in the fringe. No one lives in the middle of that dark wood. We won't pass through my village. Though Lareth Downs is another day's journey east of here. It's not on the way to the place where I found the dagger. And the legends you've heard, they hold the Palace of Skulls to be in this part of Lareth? Yes. It's said that Mad Prince Ketheril built a great fortress in Lareth with the heads of his enemies. That was at the time when Gwyneth and the rest of the Moonshaes were only a lot of small principalities. Ketheril made war on all of his neighbors. They say his cruelty was surpassed only by his might. The youth shrugged. He must have been pretty tough, since he eventually drove all the other humans from southern Gwyneth. All the tales claim that he was a ruthless master, Paldo agreed. His conquests are matters of history, though I'd always presumed his reputation for bloodshed to be exaggerated. Still, no one seems to doubt the tales of his doomed legion. At Stefanik's puzzled look, Paldo added, At least no one outside of Lareth. The legion was made up of his lieutenants, each magically branded with a skull that was their master's symbol. I'd heard that each of the prince's men had sworn to give his life to protect him, Stefanik admitted, but never anything about them being branded. It's not surprising, though, since the prince was always so interested in magic. Paldo laughed. It's so ironic that the wizard Flamstead and his spellcasting finally proved Ketheril's undoing, since he was so taken with sorcery himself. Aye, the wizard and the Earth Mother. The humans say the goddess exacted revenge against Ketheril because he distressed the balance. Stefanik nodded seriously. The tales I've heard all over the Moonshades include the Earth Mother, the older halfling said. Had you heard that Catheril dedicated his gruesome fortress to the new moon of the summer solstice? He held a great celebration with his most loyal followers. They killed hundreds of captives in a grim arena called the Circus Bazaar. I seem to remember simply for the amusement of the prince and his evil band. It's said that he captured the young king and queen of a human realm and put them to death along with the rest. They were the first human monarchs to fly the banner of the Great Bear, Stephanie chimed in. Imagine they were put to death by Catheril, but their symbol has lived on to become the talisman of the high kings of the folk. I used to believe that the king must have been taken by treachery, but now I think maybe he was captured by the Legion of the Damned. The Doomed Legion, Paldo corrected. And it was on the moonless night of the slaughter that the curse took effect, Stephanie whispered, then glanced at the night sky. Yes, the spell of the wizard coupled with the vengeful night of the Earth Mother. A black fog rolled from the forest, Paldo said, his voice a hoarse whisper, his eyes wide as he looked into the shadows around the fire. It cloaked the gathering for a full fortnight, and for all that time, Catheril and his legion huddled in their palace, fearing to go forth into the world. Then, on the night of the solstice, under the light of the full moon, the fog dissipated, and the place of skulls was gone, Catheril and all his men with it, the Lord Mayor concluded. All but one, Stephanie interjected. When Paldo looked at him in surprised confusion, the young halfling continued. That's the tale in Lareth at least. A thief named Garius, a rogue who's traveled all across the world, was among Catheril's men. Garius had grown to despise his evil master. The thief appreciated wrongdoing for the profit's sake, but had no taste for wanton cruelty. It is said that under the cover of the fog he fled his master and his gruesome palace. Did he escape? Inquired Paldo, intrigued by this new version of the legend. No one knows for certain, Stefanik said, his voice hushed. Everyone thinks he got away before the curse took Catheril, but no one saw him again. Some say he escaped the castle, but not the prince's terrible magic. He shrugged. Most of the old folks in Lareth Down say Garius was transformed into something horrible as punishment for his treachery. Maybe that's true, Paldo noted with a yawn. But we won't ever find out if any of these legends are true unless we get some rest. Then we can talk about it more tomorrow, I guess, Stephanie said cheerily. We'll have time since it'll take us most of the day to get to the palace where I found the dagger. But it won't be hard to find. Like I told you, it's at the fork of the two streams. Splendid, splendid, replied Paldo. His voice trailed off, and despite a few persistent questions from his young companion, the Lord Mayor of Lowhill would make no more speculations aloud at any rate. The next day began on the move, through the shadowy reaches of the forest. Dark, thick trunks rose around them, leafy branches crowding the air, forming a dense canopy overhead. The verdant ceiling blocked any ray of sunlight from reaching the ground, and the two halflings rode through a dim twilight. A soft bed of moss, leaves, and pine needles covered the ground, allowing for easy travel. Paldo felt a confining, almost claustrophobic sense of oppression as they rode between the pillars of rough bark. He soon missed the open stretches of the moors, where even the mist seemed distant and friendly compared to these looming sentinels. The air was moist and cloying, with humidity that dampened his forehead and an overpowering scent of dirt and pine. He longed for a breath of wind, an eternal companion on the moor, and yet not a breeze stirred in the trees. Toward the middle of the day they reached the bank of a deep, cold creek. Birch Brook, Stefanik announced. If we follow it upstream, we'll come to the place where I found the dagger. Even the waterway lay within the shroud of Lareth's canopy, for the trees on either bank were so huge and soaring that the width of the stream bed could not keep their branches from mingling. Gray boulders jutted from the murky waters, the river washing around them in eerie silence. For the rest of the afternoon, the halflings made their way along the banks of the birch brook. The stream surged with relentless force, but it seemed unusually quiet to Paldo. The water was deep, often collecting in dark pools after a tumbling spill down a chute over a short drop. Yet even in these rapids, the birch brook did not splash and froth as he would have expected. The veteran traveler found something in the stealthy stream even more unsettling than the cloaking forest. "There!" cried Stefanik, urging his pony forward. "See where the two creeks come together?" "Yes. Good guiding, lad," Paldo replied, pleased. Two smaller streams formed a Y as they merged to create the deeper, wider birch brook. The right branch frolicked down a stairway like a progression of stone shelves. In some places the branches overhead actually gaped slightly, allowing thin beams of sunlight to reflect brilliantly from the surface. The river's left branch seemed to Paldo more like the birch brook proper. It meandered through a channel that was not as steep as the other. Though the current moved quickly, the water didn't splash with the same vitality as its neighboring stream. "The middle, that's where I camped. I found the dagger there," Stefanik explained. As they approached the spot, Paldo saw that the place between the two channels indeed seemed like a perfect camping site. The ground was flat, free of trunks and roots. Several large rocks had been gathered in a protective circle, providing a windbreak for a fire and screening any blaze from casual observation. "We can cross the right branch," continued the young halfling. "There's a good ford there." The two ponies waded into the stream, which splashed only to their knees, then emerged into the flat clearing. The charred embers of an old fire huddled between several of the boulders Paldo had seen earlier. "Is that the remnants of your blaze?" he asked Stephanie as they both dismounted. "Yes, there's the old birch root I pulled out before I went to sleep," replied the younger traveler, kneeling beside the gritty fire scar. "No one's been here since me." "I'm not surprised," muttered Paldo. The murkiness of the forest was now unnervingly oppressive, but he shrugged off the feeling as best he could. "Where did you find the knife?" "Over here." Stephanie crossed to the left fork of the converging streams, indicating a shallow depression near the bank. "It was lying right here. This hole is where I pulled it out." Paldo kneeled beside the shallow excavation. Freshly turned dirt lined the hole, although tufts of moss already tinged exposed earth. The depression matched the dagger's length. The object had rested just above the water level of the stream between a pair of rocks. Looking up the channel, Paldo saw gloomy outcroppings of granite looming through the trees. The creek emerged from a deep cut between these high walls. Though tree trunks blocked much of the view, he saw the passage nestled between these bluffs, a narrow canyon, source of this left branch of the birch brook. He studied the steeply sloping stream bed, dropping from that narrow gap to the small backwater at his feet. Confidently, Paldo took the dagger out of his pouch and held it before him. "Show me the place of skulls," he commanded, waiting for the telltale flush of heat to infuse the handle. Nothing happened. "Maybe you have to drop it to the ground," Stefanik suggested. Paldo threw the blade to his feet, but it lay lifelessly in the dirt. "What did you do before to make it glow? I mean, and point toward Catherine's palace?" Stefanik wondered. "I don't know," Paldo snapped, but then bit his mouth shut. "Look!" he hissed. As it had in Low Hill, the dagger began to glow. The halflings could feel its warmth as they stood over it. Then, very slowly, the weapon wiggled across the ground. In a few moments it lay still, pointing directly at the narrow rocky gap up the stream. "Up there," Paldo said. "That's where it came from." It looks pretty dark," Stefanik observed hesitantly. "Morning will brighten it up," Paldo announced, his voice heartier than his thoughts. In truth, the forest-shrouded chasm seemed like a foreboding place. It didn't take him more than a moment to decide to postpone its exploration until the morrow. Stefanik unsaddled the ponies, while Paldo gathered some dry branches he found scattered conveniently around the camp. He set them beside the fire scar and looked to Stefanik's, only to see the younger halfling freeze taut, his eyes bulging at a sight behind Paldo's shoulder. The Lord Mayor whirled to confront a pair of unblinking yellow eyes, less than 6 feet away. A canine face stared impassively, a narrow snout gaped, while a pink tongue lolled between long white fangs. "Wolf!" Stefanik hissed. Paldo had already recognized the powerful body of the predator. The creature squatted upon a rock, ready to pounce. Yelping in astonishment, Paldo fumbled for his sword, but all he managed to do was stumble backwards, to collapse into an ungainly heap. All the time the wolf stared at him with those penetrating yellow eyes. By the time he had his sword half drawn, the halfling realized that the creature presented no immediate menace. "He looks hungry," observed Stefanik. The wolf's flanks showed the clear outline of his rib cage, screened only slightly by scattered patches of mangy fur. One of his ears flopped sideways, scarred by an ugly red wound. At the sound of the voice, the wolf shifted his gaze to the younger halfling's face, the good ear cocked forward attentively. "Give him something to eat," hissed Paldo, more than a little embarrassed by his clumsiness and still not certain of the wolf's intentions. "Here, fellow," said Stefanik, pulling an entire slab of bacon from the saddlebags. He threw it into the ground near the animal. The wolf's eyes followed the meat, but then came back to Paldo. Finally, hunger won out. The creature sniffed tentatively, then hopped down from the rocky perch, with another look at Paldo, who still had not climbed to his feet. The wolf settled to his haunches, tearing at the tough meat, with teeth still white, long and sharp. In short order, the wolf put a dent in their stockpile of cheese as well. Keeping a wary eye on the beast, Paldo built the fire while Stefanik stretched out the bedrolls. They cooked some bacon for themselves, throwing another morsel to the wolf as full darkness descended. Finally, the animal dropped its head into its outstretched forelegs with a contented sigh. "I think we found a friend," Stefanik said as the wolf closed its eyes. "I suppose we could have a worse companion in these woods," Paldo observed warily. The thought of sleeping here with this huge carnivore just a few feet away bothered him more than a little. "Maybe we should give him some more bacon." "I think we should let him rest. He looks all worn out." In fact, the animal appeared to have reached the end of a long and grueling trail. The shaggy flanks, now noticeably bulging, rose and fell with deliberate breathing. Paldo noticed that the animal's muzzle and forelegs were also scarred, though not as badly as the ear. Many wounds, however, showed raw and moist. They had not yet had time to heal. "Don't wolves always travel in packs?" asked the young halfling. "It seems odd to see one by himself." "Do you see lots of wolves in Lareth Forest?" demanded Paldo. Stefanik shook his head. "They're rare. Once or twice in the fall and winter, we've seen them roaming past the village like gray ghosts in the forest. They don't bother us. In fact, they haven't even gone after the sheep kept by Whitebeard Carryweather. But even then, when we see them, there's always a pack, at least a dozen, sometimes 20 or more. From the look of this one, he's had to fight for his life. I wonder if he's the last survivor of his pack," Paldo mused. I don't know what could slaughter so many wolves, Stephanie said. There are bears out there, but a wolf could outrun one without a problem. What about furblocks? Paldo shook his head. Even if the giant king came this far south, they wouldn't do this to the wolves. Sometimes they capture them for pets, but they wouldn't torture and maim them. Soon the unsettled pair of halflings curled into their bedrolls and went to sleep. Neither slumbered soundly, and Paldo stirred as soon as the gray dawn filtered through the mist of the stream bed. The wolf, he saw, was still there, though the animal no longer slept. Indeed, the yellow eyes followed Paldo's every move, as the halfling rose and crossed to Stefanik, nudging the youngster to wakefulness. They packed up their camp, half hoping the wolf would be on its way. But when they started into the narrow canyon, the wolf bounded ahead, picking a way around gnarled roots and over massive rocks. He led them straight into the canyon. The chasm walls, great shoulders of granite, glowered overhead. Streaks of moss and lichen ran across their weathered faces, and the rocky walls projected a chill that sapped every vestige of warmth from the air. The stream narrowed to a channel choked with debris. Nevertheless, Paldo had no lingering doubts that the source of the splendid dagger would be found near the headwaters of this creek. "We won't be able to take the ponies through," Paldo announced, gesturing into the steep and narrow canyon. "Let's picket them here and try to get back by nightfall." Stefanik too realized the futility of taking the steeds through the maze of rocks and deadfalls. The wolf watched them from its vantage of higher boulder as they dismounted, loosely tied the mounts, and selected a few important items, weapons, flasks of oil, and a platinum dagger to carry as they progressed on foot. Surprisingly, the wolf seemed more interested in them than in their horses. The ragged animal again sprang forward, disappearing behind the large rock. It popped up a dozen places ahead, its face turned alertly back to see if the halfling still followed. Yeah, wait a minute," muttered Paldo, irritated at the ease with which the animal negotiated the rough terrain. "If he's coming with us, we ought to give him a name," Stefanik suggested, struggling over a fallen trunk that bristled with prickly branches. "Be my guest," grunted the older halfling as he, too, worked his way over the obstacle. "How about Half-Ear?" suggested Stefanik, taking Paldo's frustrated numbling for acquiescence. "Hey, Wolf, Half-Ear, how about finding a better path?" But Half-Ear only regarded them impassively. For several minutes they scrambled silently along the stream bank to the wolf's latest vantage. By then, of course, the animal had bounded forward another 24 paces. Paldo and Stefanik grunted and cursed their way up the narrow canyon. There was no path indeed. Deadfalls, rock slides, and thorny thickets all choked the base of the narrow chasm, making every step a struggle. Always Half-Ear remained before them, crawling under logs that blocked the halflings, scrambling up a steep surface of tumbled rock in a few bounds. Following slowly, the two-footed explorers climbed with painstaking care, hoisting their packs by rope only after they had made these perilous ascents. The stream continued to flow beside them, rushing with silent power along a deep channel, for the most part free of the rocks that so typically obstructed the stream bed lower down. Finally, the walls to either side began to lean away from them, and soon they reached the top of the tangled chute. Straggling up a pile of boulders that spilled along the shore of the stream, Paldo paused to catch his breath. Half-Ear waited patiently in a forest glade a short distance ahead. "Open space," grunted the Lord Mayor as his young companion joined him. "Looks like the same kind of forest we saw below. Thank the Earth Mother for that," moaned Stefanik, collapsing on the rock pile in exhaustion. Then he looked around. Where's Half-Ear?" "Wait a minute, you mangy cur," barked Paldo as the wolf started through the glade towards the shadowed forest on the other side. "Give us a—" His shock swallowed the rest of his complaint. "What is it?" asked Stefanik, following his companion's gaze. Then his voice too faded into stunned silence. The structure in the woods before them was at first barely visible, so dense was the screen of tree trunks. Yet as the halfling squinted, a blocky outline came into view, a rectangular shape, like a long, high wall, pale gray or even white in color. Paldor's first thought was that the outline was far too regular to be a clump of rocks or a hill. It is some kind of a building," Stefanik said, unconsciously lowering his voice to whisper, "and Half-Ear's going towards it." "Well, best not let him go alone," muttered Paldo, surprised at his lack of enthusiasm. Something about the appearance of this bizarre structure they had yet to get a good look at unsettled him in a way he found difficult to ignore. Is it me, or do you think it's starting to get dark?" asked Stefanik. He glanced nervously at the dim forest surrounding them. Paldo didn't answer, but the growing twilight made him realize that they had spent the bulk of the day climbing through the tangled canyon. The usually shaded wood had already begun to sink into heavier shadow. Cautiously, as if he expected attack at any moment, he crept towards the edifice, darting from tree trunk to tree trunk, examining his goal from each vantage before moving forward again. Half-Ear, in contrast, trotted right up to the thing and sat down expectantly, as if impatient for his companions to join the bold expedition. Soon the halflings were close enough to see the details of the building, looming behind a screen of huge pines. As they emerged from the trees, the whole structure opened up to view, and they stared in wonder. The white surface they had first spotted was the front wall, and it was not as smooth as Paldo had originally thought. A multitude of turrets and parapets extended along the top, and a single doorway, large and yawning, open, stood in the exact center. The wolf sat directly before this entrance. And though they thought they had taken full stock of the castle from their vantage, only as the halflings approached the entrance did the true nature of the structure become apparent. "The whole place is made of bones," whispered Stefanik. "Look, skulls, human skulls. The legends are true." Paldo felt a deep chill shudder through him as he stared at the wall of eyeless sockets. Most of the castle's surface he saw consisted of these grisly remnants stacked neatly together as if placed by a master brickslayer. The frame of the doorway was formed by only 3 bones, like thigh bones, only each was at least 10 feet long. "Even fur blocks don't have legs that big," Paldo murmured, awestruck. "Do you think that's where the knife came from?" Stefanik asked reluctantly. Maybe you were wrong about the mark." "I'm sure it came from up here," Paldo replied and stepped boldly forward, though the garish structure awakened feelings of abiding terror within him. It also drew him forward with a thrill of discovery, adventure, and treasure. He had, after all, earned his reputation as a hero by facing supernatural threats even more threatening than this phantom castle. "Say, what about the ponies?" Stefanik looked back at their path, his face wistful. "We can't leave them alone all night." "They'll be all right. There's plenty of grass around there." "What about wolves?" Stefanik wondered. "I'm sure Half-Ear's the only one, and he's with us. You might even say he's showing us the way. Come on." Paldo started once more towards the looming entrance. His mind whirled with images, mounds of coins, gleaming gemstones, fabulous artifacts. Half-Ear bounced to his feet and paced ahead of them through the doorway. One boldly, the other reluctantly, the halflings followed the wolf under the bone arch. Enough light filtered through gaps in the crude stonework bonework. Paldo reminded himself to light the interior just a little. Before the halflings had advanced 24 paces, however, the darkness grew heavier, and they paused to remove lanterns from their packs. Filling them with oil, touching spark to wick, they soon resumed their exploration under brighter illumination. The entryway was a wide corridor, smoothly paved below their feet, apparently with actual stone. Paldo saw with a measure of relief. The walls to either side, however, formed an array of eyeless sockets and grinning teeth, for they were built exclusively of skulls. "There are thousands of them," gasped Stefanik, as they came to an intersection and saw 3 other corridors, each lined with leering skeletal faces. The air was dry and odorless, but each breath seemed to parch the halflings' tongues and throats of moisture. They each gulped a swallow from the water skin, as much to calm their nerves as quench their thirst. "Which way should we go?" asked Stefanik. A longing glance back to the entrance registered the youngster's vote on that question. "The dagger," Paldo hissed. He took the platinum weapon from his belt pouch and held it before each of the 3 passages. "The Palace of Skulls," the Lord Mayor intoned, picturing vast piles of treasure in his mind. He waited for several moments, remembering that the effect had been delayed before. Yet now, perhaps because they were in the palace, it gave them no clue. "We'll have to guess. Let's go this way," Paldo announced with pause. Paldo had taken only a half-dozen steps down the hall, straight ahead, when his lamplight reflected with a telltale gleam from a scattering of metal along the base of one wall. "Gold!" exclaimed the Lord Mayor, forgetting even to keep his voice down. Eagerly he knelt to investigate, holding the lamp over several dozen gilded coins shining up at him from the floor. "Shouldn't they be dusty?" wondered Stefanik aloud. "No!" Paldo's voice hissed with delight. "This place is only here for a fortnight. Then it disappears. When is there time for dust to collect?" "What?" Stefanik's voice trailed away. The older halfling scooped the coins and dropped them quickly into his satchel. Their bulk created a satisfying weight in the bottom of the bag. "Come on," Paldo urged, picking up the pace. Half-Ear trotted readily beside them, while Stefanik hurried to stay close behind. They passed in a huge vaulted chamber, where the light from their lanterns created little pools of illumination in a great waste of darkness. Stefanik started across the flat floor, but Paldo called him back. "Look, niches along the wall. Let's have a look as we go." He held the lantern up between a pair of arches, lighting an empty space, small and square with a high ceiling supported by arching bones. "Alcoves. Maybe this is where Ketherill's doomed legion had their quarters," whispered Stefanik, awestruck and terrified. "Maybe," Paldo said, then added triumphantly, "but they're empty now. There's no haunted guards here waiting to suck out our soul. So much for the old legends." "No treasure either," the younger halfling countered. "Patience, Sprout. We've barely begun to search." Paldo moved on, following the row of nearly identical compartments. He checked the next and the one after. In a few moments he was rewarded. "What do you know?" he announced smugly, kneeling down to lift a small statuette, a figure of a crouching lion, from the floor. Like the gold coins, it gleamed as if it had been freshly polished. "Pure silver with rubies for eyes." Quickly he popped the object into his satchel, continuing his explorations. Before he had completed his investigation of the room, which took the better part of an hour, a pair of golden earrings, an emerald-studded brooch, and a jeweled headband had joined the objects in his bag. The shaggy wolf followed him through the entire circuit, yellow eyes sparkling in the torchlight, as if he too understood the worth of their finds. "If these were the chambers of Catherill's loyal followers," Stefanik observed, "they must have lived in pretty cramped quarters." "Look here!" Paldo stooped to lift another gleaming treasure from the floor. "It's another figurine," he added softly, turning over the hand-sized image of a human warrior. He examined it carefully, then drew in his breath. There, at the base of the figure's back, he saw the faint outline of a skull. "Shouldn't we get going?" asked Stefanik, as Paldo clinched up the bag. "There's a lot more of this place to explore," Paldo replied with a firm shake of his head. He led the other halfling to a winding, circuitous exploration of the palettes of skulls. Half-Ear preceded them along some corridors, while Paldo's curiosity and intuition took them down others. They found high galleries, and a great ballroom, and even a deep pit that Paldo guessed had been the circus bazaar. It was surrounded by rings of benches, all made from various pieces of bone. Here Paldo almost overlooked a pair of rings. Unlike the other treasures, these lay under a thin film of dust and dirt. Each was inscribed with a stamp in the image of the Great Bear. After a quick appraisal, the gold was pure. Paldo decided he dropped the items into the satchel with the rest. "The bears prove it," Stefanik said. "The story is true. He did kill the king and queen who bore that symbol as their own." Several more treasures yielded themselves to the intrepid explorers, or to Paldo, actually, for Stefanik spent most of the time staring wide-eyed into the shadows, urging the older halfling to hurry. Yet the Lord Mayor of Low Hill would not be rushed. He found a gem-studded necklace and bracelets that he felt certain were fully equal to the worth of a large house. A few steps later, a tiny crystal image of a knight on horseback caught his eye with its glittering diamond facets and slender lens of platinum. Half-Ear paced along ahead of him, nosing the shadows, looking back with apparent impatience at the halfling. They pressed around a corner and found a stairway leading up. Paldo didn't hesitate to start climbing, with Stefanik following reluctantly, his eyes wide, flickering this way and that at the grotesque death's heads lining the walls to both sides. "Wait, I think I saw something," hissed the youth. "What? Where? More gold?" asked Paldo, whirling around on the stairs. "No, something moved," wailed Stefanik. "Down there, something dark." Paldo followed his companion's trembling gesture, but he could make out nothing beyond the shadows cloaking the foot of the stairs. The light from their lanterns seemed suddenly a very feeble counter to the oppressive darkness. As Paldo held the sputtering flame, the halfling felt acutely conscious that its illumination made him perfectly visible to someone or something lurking within the gloom. Quickly, he shuttered the vessel, ordering Stefanik to do the same. In the fullness of the dark, they waited soundlessly. Slowly their eyes adjusted to the murk. Though they could see nothing in the way of detail, the vague contours of the walls and stairway gradually took form around them. "Stay here," commanded Paldo, setting down his oil lamp. He drew his short sword, little relishing the familiar weight in his hand. Then, as an additional precaution, he reached into the satchel and took out the platinum dagger. Holding the smaller blade with his left hand, he raised his sword and started down the stairs. He felt the reassuring presence of Half-Ear's shaggy flank beside him. Step by careful step he descended, brandishing the sword with more menace than he felt. He reached the bottom step, then felt the smooth floor of the corridor under his feet. Staring to the left and right, he could barely make out the obscure outlines of the passageway. Beside him, Half-Ear's rapid breathing created a taut cadence for his fear. "There's nothing down here," he whispered. Stefanik made no sound on the stairs, so Paldo repeated the observation more loudly. The silence up the stairs was more frightening than anything he'd imagined in the shadows. "Stefanik!" he barked. But still there came no answer. Paldo and the wolf bounded up the stairs, stumbling into the soft mound of his satchel. Sheathing his sword, he fumbled for the lantern and opened the shutter. Stefanik was gone, though the youngster's lantern rested on the step above the satchel. Desperately, the Lord Mayor looked up the rest of the stairway. The young halfling could not have gone down the stairs without being seen, and Paldo had noticed no doors. Cold terror seized Paldo, along with a profound sense that the disaster had overtaken them with this stunning speed. Shrugging the pack over one shoulder, the halfling took the lantern, albeit awkwardly, in his left hand. Again drawing his sword, he started up the remaining steps, 10 or 12 in number, until he came to a landing where wide corridors extended in 3 directions. "Stefanik!" he called again. Paldo felt a wave of awful loneliness sweep over him. Suddenly the treasures in his satchel, the lure of wealth that had compelled him further and further through this dolorous place, paled to the insignificance against the weight of his young companion's life. Half-Ear growled softly. Then the wolf started down the middle passageway, pausing after a few steps to look back at the halfling. Grimly clutching his short sword in one hand, the dagger and the lantern in the other, Paldo followed the pacing animal down the central corridor, through a room of tall columns and under a narrow archway beyond. Several places along the way, gold winked seductively from niches in the walls, or the telltale glitter of gemstones tried to coax him from his course. But the halfling moved on resolutely. He entered another large chamber, a domed ceiling standing high above his head. Crossing carefully, he held his lantern up and tried to look into the shadows. Half-Ear paced beside him, head up and eyes alert. Suddenly the wolf froze, growling deep within his chest. Paldo saw a dim form standing utterly still in the darkness, an erect figure no more than 3 feet tall. "Stefanik!" Paldo yelped, running toward the young halfling. But as abruptly as Paldo started forward, he stopped. Stefanik had not turned, had not reacted in any way to his shout. Something is definitely wrong, he decided. Then the shadows beyond the young halfling moved, and Paldo felt a chill creep to the very marrow of his bones. A shape loomed there, a huge shape, and the halfling could not prevent a dull moan of horror escaping his lips. The murk parted, but only to reveal a thing of even more profound darkness, a hulking figure, larger than a man, with shoulders and head rising in the inky chamber. Paldo saw upraised arms, black and menacing, yet somehow tenuous, like thick oily smoke. Cold swirled around him, threatening to suck the heat and life from his body. He saw long, wickedly curving claws at the ends of the reaching limbs. Then a hideous visage materialized, snarling jaws spread wide to reveal a crimson tongue and blackened, hideous teeth. Most horrifying, however, were the thing's eyes, hellishly gleaming embers of hatred and doom that stared unwaveringly at the trembling halfling. Who are the thieves seeking to pilfer the treasure of Catheril? The voice rumbled through the cavernous room, and Paldo felt as though a bolt of lightning had welded him to the floor. The hair at the back of his neck stood on end, and he sensed the unmistakable aura of magic crackle the air. Then he realized another terrifying fact. The wraith's voice had come from all around him. Spinning through a frantic circle, he saw a dozen shapes, all menacing, all rather indistinct. Yet the same hellish eyes gleamed from each, and taloned limbs reached out from them all, eager to tear Paldo to pieces. "Who are you?" the halfling gasped, finally summoning the strength to speak. "I am Prince Catheril." Again the voice, a storm ravaging a distant valley. Besides Paldo, Half-Ear growled and crouched, eyes gleaming in the lamplight, flickering from first one to another of the circling horrors. "Stefanik!" shouted Paldo. The tousled head twisted as if the youngster tried to turn but failed. It was as if Stefanik were trying to look at his companion but could not muster the strength. Again, Half-Ear growled, fear tingling his snarl. "Do not waste your breath," hissed Catheril. "Like you, he is my prisoner." "What did you do to him?" Paldo asked, slowly circling to face all the looming figures. "What did I do to him?" his conscience added harshly. He well remembered Stefanik's pleas to depart from this place and his own insistence on pursuing the elusive treasure. "I have done nothing, but I plan to make him one of my treasures, my trinkets," said Catheril. "I understand you have spent much of the night collecting the others." "What do you mean?" "They were all shiftless and deceitful, even my fearless legion, all like that traitor Garius." Catheril smiled horribly. "He fled my home at my hour of greatest need, but that couldn't protect him from my wrath." The voice deepened, gargling with a hellish boil. "Like all those lured here by the promise of riches, drawn deeper into my web by their own greed, you and your thieving friend shall forever linger among those walls. Like all those who've tried to rob me or lie to me, you'll become things of imaginary value, all glitter but no substance." "I have seen plenty of substance in here," challenged the halfling, though he instantly regretted the foolish outburst. "Do you think so? Perhaps you should look again." Suddenly sick to his stomach, Paldo realized that the platinum dagger felt surprisingly light in his hand. Glancing down, he saw the thing as it really was, a piece of cheap tin set with glass baubles. He knew immediately that the rest of the treasures in his satchel would prove no more valuable. Paldo tried to still the trembling in his limbs. Desperately in his mind sought a plan. He looked around frantically, seeking some inspiration. Half-Ear stood beside the halfling, his yellow eyes darting around the circle of figures. The hackles of the wolf's back bristled. His nose twitched as canine lips curled into a teeth-baring snarl. Paldo raised his lantern, acutely conscious of the sputtering flame, the small reservoir of oil still feeding the wick. The clay jar was heavy in his hand. More than half the fuel remained. "Stefanik!" he called again. Once more the young halfling struggled, caught in a battle of wills, but still he could not turn, could not speak. "Fool!" spat Catheril. Again the sound came from all over the chamber. The flickering light of Paldo's lantern trembled as he tried in vain to still the shaking of his hand. He saw one chance, a slim, desperate gamble, But that gamble was the only thing that offered even a faint hope of escape. He'd guessed correctly. He cast the dagger onto the floor and shouted a word, not the name of this nightmarish place, for he had realized that the Palace of Skulls was not the dagger's true point of orientation. Instead, he shouted a name, and with the speaking of the word, the dagger flared like the sun. "Catheril!" Paldo cried. The blade whirled on the floor and abruptly came to a stop. It pointed towards one of the circling images, farther from Paldo than the rest, almost lost in the shadows. The instant its true identity was revealed, the wraith lunged forward, extending icy claws towards its foe. With shocking speed, those deadly talons neared Paldo's face. Half-Ear growled, the sound low and rumbling in the cavernous room. The animal crouched momentarily, nostrils twitching, then leaped, his growl building into a savage snarl. Half-Ear clamped his jaws on one of Catheril's writhing limbs. The cursed prince lashed out, sending the wolf flying, but the valiant attack gave Paldo the instant he needed to raise his arm, hoisting the flaring lantern high over his head. Grunting, he hurled the makeshift missile. The clay jar struck the floor at the prince's feet, smashing to pieces and splashing oil across the hissing creature. As the wick touched the slick stonework, orange flame leaped to engulf the body of Catheril. "No!" The sound was a shrieking wail, like a hurricane of wind swirling through a wide canyon, tearing at trees and rocks and even the earth itself. The trembling became real then, more than the gale of an unnatural wind. Paldo staggered as the floor moved beneath his feet. The prince surged towards him, trailing fire. Paldo grabbed the gaudy dagger that had lured him to the palace. He knew now that it was only a trinket, but one with a difference. The dagger was the only one to be found outside the Palace of Skulls. The doomed legion and the other treasure seekers had been converted to cheap baubles, but always within the walls of the palace. That meant the dagger could be the ensorcelled remains of only one person. "Here, Garius," Paldo whispered, cradling the knife before him. "Now's the chance to return to your master." He hurled the blade towards the prince, and he saw, or imagined he saw, Catheril's eyes widen in horror. The blade sank deep in the creature's chest, and the monster stumbled backwards in a cloud of hissing steam. Paldo didn't wait to see what happens next. He leaped forward, seizing Stephanik's collar and yanking the young halfling around. The red-haired youth gaped at the spectacle of Catheril's agony, blinking in astonishment. "Come on!" shouted Paldo. "You are mine!" shrieked the cursed prince, leaping forward, extending flaming limbs towards the two halflings. Half-Ear roared forward in a raging attack, ignoring the flames to sink his teeth into the black figure's torso. The thing that had been Catheril lashed out with its long talons, but the wolf ducked underneath the swiping blow. In the flashing light, Paldo saw the wounds on Half-Ear's flank, and he knew this was the creature that could destroy an entire pack, could nearly kill this brave wolf who had all but led the two halflings here on a quest for his own vengeance. The black shape and the snarling canine whirled around on the floor, the two intruders forgotten for the moment. Stephanik stumbled to his knees as the floor pitched beneath him, but then scrambled back to his feet. His will had returned with the breaking of the monster's concentration. Paldo propelled him toward the floor, and the youth sprinted from the room, followed by the Lord Mayor and then the bounding wolf. In blind terror, they ran through the halls of the Palace of Skulls, fleeing the menace that they felt rather than saw. They raced along corridors, hurled themselves down long stairways, gasping for breath but not daring to slow the frantic pace of their flight. Objects bounded from the satchel as Paldo ran. Glass baubles and cheap metal figurines clinked and shattered along the floor behind him, and he took no note of the lost treasures. Finally, the door, with its overhanging arch of bone, yawned before them. Lungs straining and eyes tearing, the two halflings tumbled out of the bone-walled structure, collapsing onto the forest floor amid the gray mists of the advancing dawn. The wolf followed them through the portal, but then spun and crouched, glowering into the palace. They saw no sign of movement or pursuit as they hugged their aching sides. Their breathing slowed and their rubbery legs gradually regained their strength. Staggering against a tree for support, Paldo dropped the satchel in frustrated anger. "Were they all worthless?" asked Stefanik as he looked through the junk in the satchel. "Illusions," Paldo said in disgust. "Stuff to draw intruders further into the palace until finally they face Catheril. Look, here's something that didn't turn into junk," Stefanik exclaimed. He pulled out a pair of golden rings, set with a great bear, the only objects that had been dirty when Poldo found them. "The rings," mused the Lord Mayor. "These were real, a treasure of slain victims, not the transformed minions of Catheril." "Here," said Stefanik, handing the two bands of metal to Paldo. "You should have these." "Nay, lad, too much trouble has come of this." Yet when Stefanik insisted, Paldo remembered his original intention in seeking the source of the platinum dagger to find a present for the king's and queen's anniversary. The rings bore the symbol of the Munche's royal family, a symbol that now could be traced back to the human rulers slain long, long ago by the Mad Prince. Paldo slipped the rings into his pocket. At least, he reflected, he had found a suitable present for Tristan and Robin. Elminster at the Mage Fair, Ed Greenwood. What's more dangerous than a mage out to rule the entire world? Why, a mage at play, of course. The symbol, Witch Queen of Aglarond. Warnings, Year of the Dark Dragon, 1336 DR. The rosy light of early morning had scarcely brightened into the full radiance of day, but the bard and her gaunt companion had already been in the saddle for some time. Storm Silverhand, the bard of Shadowdale, was an adventurer of wide experience and fame. She was also a senior and respected member of the Harpers, that mysterious band always working for the good of the world. A veteran of many perilous forays, always alert, she watched her surroundings constantly as she traveled, hand never far from the hilt of her sword, its blade run with blood more than once already on this journey. As she rode, Storm sang softly to herself. She was happy to be in the saddle again, even on a ride into known danger. For 10 days she had ridden beside a white-haired man as tall as herself but thinner. The man was aged and clumsy rider. He wore simple, much-patched robes covered with old food stains and trailed sweet-smelling pipe smoke wherever he went. Though he didn't look it, the old man was an adventurer even more famous than Storm, the old mage, Elminster of Shadowdale. More than 500 winters had painted his long beard white. His twinkling blue eyes had seen empires rise and fall, and spied worlds beyond Toril, vast and strange. He knew more secrets than most wizards, and simpler, more honest men, too, might ever suspect to exist. The years had sharpened Elmnister's temper and his tongue, and built his magic to a height that most mages could only dream of. This great wizard wore old floppy leather boots, and most of the time an irritated expression. At night, on the far side of the fire, he snored like a crowhorn in torment, but he knew it and used magic to mute the noise for the sake of his friend and trailmate. Storm loved him dearly, snores and all, even if he tended to treat her like a little girl. Despite their friendship, it was unusual for Storm to be riding at the old mage's side. When Elmnister left Shadowdale on prolonged trips, it was his habit to trust the defense of the dale to the bard. This time, just before the mage's departure, a Harper agent had brought a request from one of Storm's sisters. Would she please guard Elmnister when he went on the mage fair? In all her years of adventuring, Storm had never heard of a mage fair, but the very name sounded ominous. She had been surprised at the easy good humor with which the old mage had accepted her announcement that this time, when he left home, she'd be riding with him. In fact, she suspected he'd used horses for the trek rather than whisking himself across Faerun in a trice by magic, just to prolong their time together. Every night Elmnister settled himself and his pipe down beside their fire to listen to her pluck a harp and sing old ballads. In return, when she lay down under the watching glittering stars, he'd softly tell tales of old Faerun until sleep claimed her. After years of riding the wastes with hardy, hardened warriors, Storm was astonished at how much she'd enjoyed this trip with the odd mage. But now it seemed they had reached their destination, though it was nothing at all like she heard and imagined. "Why here?" Storm Silverhand asked with tolerant good humor as she reined in beside Elmnister on a ridge far from Shadowdale. The bright morning sun cast long shadows from the stunted trees and brush around them. As far as the eye could see, rolling wilderness stretched out, untouched by the hands of man. "We must be halfway to Karatur by now." The old mage scratched his nose. "Further," he replied with seeming innocence. "And here, because one we seek is close at hand." As he spoke, a man appeared out of thin air and floated in front of them. The horses snorted and shifted in surprise. Elmnister frowned. The man stood on nothing, booted feet far above the ground. Midnight eyes glowered down of a thin, cruel white face. He towered impressively over them, clad in a dark and splendid tabard, adorned with glowing mystic signs and topped with an upthrust high collar. A carved gem-adorned staff winked and pulsed in one of his many ringed hands. "Challenge!" he addressed with his cold formal dignity, raising his empty hand in a gesture that barred the way. "Speak or pass." "Elmnister of Shadowdale," the old mage replied mildly, "and guest." The man's eyes narrowed, and he said even more coldly, "Prove yourself." "Ye doubt me?" Elmnister asked slowly. "Why, Dervius, I recall my first mage fair." He nodded in reflection and added dryly, "Ye made a most fetching toad." Dervius flushed. "You know the rule," he said harshly, waving the staff. Lights began to race along its length, brightening the crystal sphere that topped it. With slow menace, the floating man brought that glowing end down to point at the old mage. "Aye," Elmnister replied. Then he wagged a finger back and forth and announced lightly, "Nice try." The staff that menaced them snapped back upright, forced away by the power of Elmnister's sorcery. The sentinel who held it gaped at them in astonishment and fear before the muscles of his face rippled and lost their struggle against another dose of the old mage's spellcasting. The magic made Gervius giggle involuntarily for a few moments, then released him. His grin turned rapidly into a scowl of dark anger. Elminster took no notice. "There you go," he said jovially to the shaken sentinel as he urged his mount onward. "Happy magic." Storm looked back at the furious man as they topped the next ridge. The staff was flashing and flickering like a lightning storm at sea, and the sentinel was snarling and stamping angrily on the empty air. Storm glanced at Elminster and asked wonderingly, "You cast a cantrip?" "Making him giggle is proving yourself?" Elminster nodded. "A wizard must prove to a mage-fair sentinel only that he can work magic, to keep the rabble out." He rolled his eyes to show what he thought of that attitude, and calmly urged his horse down through a tumble of boulders and long grass. "Guests like thee are exempt from testing, but each mage is limited to only one such compatriot. No mage can avoid the test and be allowed into the fair. Generally young bucks cast powerful explosions and the like, or exquisite and voluptuous illusions. But in this case, meant it as an insult." Storm wrinkled her brow. "I see," she observed carefully. "I'm going to have to be very careful at this fair." Elminster waved a hand. "Ah, nay," he replied. "I must merely get a certain magical key from someone who isn't expected to be insane enough to bring it here or to have anything at all to do with it, and then have a bit of fun. Certain harpers asked me to come here to protect this friend I must meet. No doubt ye were asked to come along too, to keep a certain old mage out of trouble." He favored her with a level look. Storm smiled and nodded ruefully. The old mage chuckled. "These mage fairs are private little gatherings. I haven't been to one in years, and we're far enough from home that my face won't be well known. Certain rules govern those who attend, rules meant to keep things from sinking into a general spell brawl. But ye do well to keep in mind that most everyone here can wield magic quite well. Walk softly, drink things that are offered to ye only if I am present and deem it wise. Draw thy magical blade only if ye must. Some come here to gain new spells, but most come to show off what they can do, like children at play, cruel, overpowerful children, a lot of 'em." He scratched his beard and looked thoughtful. "As to those who work against us, the names and faces of their servants at the mage fair are unknown to me." He grinned sunnily. "Suspect everyone as usual. Ye should do all right." "What is this key we seek?" Storm asked, "and why is it so valuable?" Elminster shrugged. "It's precious only because of what it opens. Its form and purpose ye'll learn soon enough, which is another way of saying I scarce remember what it looks like and haven't the faintest idea why, after so many years, its importance has risen so suddenly and sharply." He cast a dry look at her and added, "Mysterious enough for ye?" Storm replied with a look that had, over the years, plunged more than one man into icy fear. Unperturbed, the old mage smiled at her as they rode up the heather-clad slope of another ridge. "Sorry, my dear, but I got quite a lecture last time from thee, as I recall, on speaking freely about all sorts of little details that should be kept secret in matters like this, so I'm flapping my jaws as little as I can this time around and acting as if only I know the great secret upon which the safety of the entire world rests. Oh, there I go. You see, I just can't help myself. 'Tis so hard to do all this intrigue and world-saving with grim and solemn seriousness when you've done it so often down the centuries. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. There were worse fates, Storm reminded herself with an inward smile, than traveling across half of Faerun with Amnester. To buoy her spirits, she spent some time trying to remember what some of them were. That dark reverie took them across several scrub-covered ridges to the lip of a deep bowl-shaped valley. A narrow trail wound down into it somewhere on their right, crossing in front of them to enter a grove of trees. The trees hid the rest of the valley from the two riders. It was then that a man in rich purple robes sailed into view. Floated would be a more accurate term, since he perched serenely on a carpet that undulated through the air like an angry snake, following the narrow trail far below. And as the bard and wizard watched, the man on the flying carpet sailed into the trees. Their leaves promptly changed color from their former green to a bright coppery hue, and several voices could be heard, raised in cries of praise of the new arrival. They had obviously reached the Mage Fair. Far off on the heights that rose on the other side of the still unseen valley, Storm saw balls of fire bursting into the air. Elminster followed the direction of her stare and said, "Ah, yes, the fireball throwing contest. Do you see? Magelings get all excited about it. Something about impressing their peers. No doubt we'll end up there all too soon. They're all allowed to challenge us older Dwemer crafters, you see, to prove their manly mettle by beating feeble dodderers. Womanly metals too, Marquis, though many maids have sense enough to avoid such vulgar displays of power." Storm raised an eyebrow. How does one fireball impress more than another? As the saying goes, aren't all that hit you the same? The old mage shook his head patiently. If a few words of the incantation are changed, the spell becomes more difficult to cast, and the size and force of its blast mirrors the power and experience of the one throwing it. One wizard can boast that this is bigger than that of the next wizard, you see. An archmage's fire sphere can be quite impressive. He paused meaningfully, then added, I mean to get in and get out of that fair, mind ye, with a minimum of dallying. Tossing fire about is more a sport for the green and foolish. Try not to seek out trouble by challenging anyone. Stay close and speak not. It's safer. And with these melodramatic words, the old mage kicked his heels and sent his horse galloping down the steep track in reckless haste, raising dust. At the bottom, Elminster plunged his mount into a crowd of laughing, chatting mages. Storm, close to his heels, had time for one stare before she entered the assembled mages. The gorge was full of folk standing shoulder to shoulder. Their robes formed a moving sea of wild colors, and the chatter was nearly deafening. There were men and women of all shapes, ages, and sizes, and a few whose gender the bard wasn't sure of. Traditional, dark flowing, wide-sleeved robes were amply in evidence, but most of the mages wore stronger, more colorful garments. Storm, who had seen much in the way of garb over many years of wandering, stared in wonder. It is widely held in Faerun among non-mages, at least, that those who work art are all, in varying degrees, crazy. In eccentricity of dress, Storm saw this was certainly correct. All manner of strange headpieces and body adornments bristled and sprouted around her, shimmering and sparkling, and in some cases shifting shape in fluid movements. One lady mage wore nothing but a gigantic many-feathered snake, which moved its slow coils continuously around her lithe body. A man nearby seemed clad only in dancing flames. The wizard he was speaking to wore a shifting phosphorescent fungus, out of which grew small leafy ferns and thistles. Next to them stood a half-elven maiden, clad in a flowing gown of gleaming, soft-polished gems strung upon many silken threads. She was arguing with a long-haired dwarf, wearing furs and leather upon which a pair of insect-eating lizards crawled ceaselessly, long tongues darting. A snatch of their conversation came to Storm's ears. "Well, what did the Thayan do then?" "Blew up the entire castle, of course. What else?" Other voices crowded in, drowning out the previous speakers. "What was that? Purple zombies? Why purple?" "She was bored, I guess. You should have seen the prince's face the next morning. She made a dozen tiny red hands appear out of thin air and pinch him in all the places he had pinched her. In front of all the court, too." Elminster was riding steadily through the throng. He seemed to know where he was going. Storm followed, past a man who was balancing a full bottle of something dark and red on his large nose and protesting in muffled tones to those watching that he wasn't using any magic to help him. She looked away just before the bottle toppled and spilled all over him, but could not resist looking back at the damp result. She was careful not to smile. "How many times must I tell thee? First you kiss, then cast a spell, or it stays a frog forever." Storm shook her head, trying to concentrate on Elminster and ignore such talk. A terrific din of conversation, strange music, humming, and weird little popping noises raged over the crowd. Wizards gestured to impress those they were speaking with, and vari-colored smokes and many-hued globes of radiance obediently bobbed or writhed in the air over their heads. And spelled birds sang complicated melodies, and some flew graceful aerial ballets. Storm peered this way and that, trying to see everything, watching for danger. Everywhere folk stood talking, arguing, laughing, or dickering, with goblets and flagons of varying sizes and contents in their hands, or floating handily in midair at their elbows. Some sort of rule, Storm guessed, kept the mages themselves from flying, floating, or teleporting about. Mostly they just stood in groups, talking. Storm threaded her mount carefully among them. 3 olive-hued tentacles slid out from under a mage's hood as she passed. Small glittering eyes opened at their ends, surveyed her, and winked. She tried not to show her involuntary shudder as she rode on, past a man with bright green hair and beard who was juggling a ring of hand-sized balls of fire in the air. The lady mage he was trying to impress was in the act of stifling a yawn. The next group was made up of old and wrinkled crones with cold dark eyes and sinister-looking black robes. They were chuckling and swiggering beer from clear glass tankards that didn't seem to empty. "First babe I ever saw that was born with wings," one was saying delightingly. "Flew around the nursery, giggling, the little scamp. Well, the king nearly swallowed his crown, I tell thee." Storm left the women behind, riding across a little open space where rising smoke and ashes suggested someone had experienced a warm and possibly fatal accident very recently. Beyond it, she plunged into the chatter once again. "You must understand, old friend, that taking shape of a dragon is an experience that changes one forever. Forever, I tell you." A mage in florid pink and purple lace at his wrists and throat was underscoring this point by flickering a long forked tongue at the mage he was speaking to, a wizardess with white, furry hair running down her arms and the backs of her hands. Her skin was a deeper purple than the garb of the wizard speaking to her. Her reply to his claims about dragon shaping was an eloquent snort. Then Storm was threading her way past 6 enchantingly beautiful half-elven sorceresses, whose heads were bent together in low-voiced intrigue. One looked up alertly, only to relax and give the bard a relieving smile. The others, intent on deal-making, never saw her. "Well, just change the name and the way you cast it, and he'll never know. I mean, anyone could have come up with a spell like that. Teach it to me, and I'll not tell where I got it. In return, I'll show you the trick of tail runes, the one that makes men swoon and—" Shaking her head, Storm hurried on through the magical bedlam, trying to catch up with the old mage. Where had he gone? She looked up and down the crowded gorge. There were hundreds of mages here. Yet, thanks to her keen eyes, she managed to find Elminster again. The old mage continued to cut through the gathered wizards without slowing or dismounting until he came to a tree-shaded corner on the far, rocky wall of the gorge. There, in the dappled gloom, a short, stunningly beautiful lady mage was talking with 5 or 6 obviously smitten men of the art. Storm saw laughing black eyes, flowing black hair, and a gown whose scanty front seemed to be made of glowing, always shifting flowers. Then the old mage vaulted, or rather fell, straight from his horse into the arms of the lady, with the words, "Duara, my dear, years have passed, simply years." Dark eyes sparkled up into his, and the old mage's effusive greetings were temporarily stilled by a deep kiss. Slim hands went around his neck, stroked his tangle of white hair, and then moved downward in a tight, passionate embrace. After Elminster's glad greetings and the long kiss, Storm heard a low, purring voice replying enthusiastically. On the faces of the men around she saw astonishment, then anger, resignation or disgust, and finally resigned disinterest. Storm also noticed Duara's fingers at the mage's belt, moving nimbly. Other eyes had seen it, too, particularly those of a tall, hooked-nosed man in a dark green velvet doublet with slashed and puffed sleeves. He'd been watching the old mage's affectionate greeting closely, his expression hidden by the smoke from his long, slim clay pipe. When Elminster finally bid the smiling beauty a noisy adieu, the hook-nosed wizard let his pipe float by itself as he strode forward, gesturing wordlessly. In response, Elminster's pouch levitated upward and opened in midair. Silence fell among the mages standing near. It was obviously by their expression that the green-clad wizard's spellwork was a serious breach of etiquette. Storm half drew her sword, but Elminster's bony hand stayed her firmly. In merry tones he asked, "Lost thy magic, colleague? Want to borrow a cup of this or that?" The wizard in green looked narrowly at him and at the lone item the pouch held, a twig. "Where is it, old man?" "The powerful magic ye seek? Why, in here," replied Elminster, tapping his own head with one finger. Unsettled, Storm peered at him. His voice seemed thicker than usual, but his eyes were as bright as ever. "But ye can't get with a simple snatching spell cast in a moment, ye know. Years of study it took me to master even—" The green wizard gestured curtly. The twig flew toward his open waiting hand. Before it got there, Elminster snapped his fingers and wiggled his eyebrows. As a result, the twig shot upward, curved in a smooth arc, and darted back toward the old mage. The wizard in green frowned and gestured again. The twig slowed abruptly, but continued to drift toward the smiling face of Elminster. The wizard's hands moved again, almost frantically, but the twig's flight and Elminster's gentle smile held steady as the wood settled into the old mage's hand. Elminster bowed to the white-faced, shaking wizard. Pleasantly he said, "But if it's the magical staff you want—" The twig instantly became a grand-looking, 10-foot-long, smooth black staff with brass ends through in coiling snake designs. "By all means, have it!" And the staff flew gently across empty air to the astonished man's hands. "But your staff?" Storm asked in wonder as she watched the sweating, dumbfounded wizard in green catch the staff not 4 paces away. "How will you replace it?" "Cut myself another one," the old mage replied serenely. "They grow on trees." Clutching the staff and eyeing Elminster anxiously, the velvet-clad wizard reclaimed his pipe, muttered something, and rapidly gestured. Abruptly he was gone, staff and all, as though he had never been there at all. Elminster shook his head disapprovingly. "Bad manners," he said severely. "Very. Teleporting at the mage fair, it just wasn't done in my day, I tell ye." "Then when was that, old man? Before the founding of Waterdeep? I'll warrant," sneered a darkly handsome young man who stood nearby. Storm turned in her saddle. This mage was richly dressed in fur-trimmed silks. His black-browed, pinched face was always sneering, it seemed. Storm recognized him as one of the wizards who'd been speaking with Duara when Elminster arrived. His voice and manner radiated cold, scornful power as he curled back his lip a little further and said, "By the way, Greybeard, you may call me Master." Gripping his own staff, one made of shining red metal, 12 feet long and adorned with ornaments of gold, the dark-brown mage reached for the reins of the old mage's riderless horse. Storm kicked out at his hand from her saddle. The toe of her boot stung his fingers and smashed them away from Elminster's mount. The handsome mage turned on her angrily to find a gleaming sword tip inches from his nose. "Heh heh," chuckled Elminster in thick, rich tones. "Not learning to leave the ladies alone yet, young master?" The mage flushed red to the roots of his hair and whirled away from Storm's blade to face the old man again. "Why, no, grandsire," he said sarcastically, "although it's obvious you've been without one for many a year." The loud insult brought a few snickers from the younger mages standing near, mingled with gasps and whistles of shocked amazement from older wizards who evidently knew Elminster. The murmuring intensified as some mages shoved closer to watch the coming confrontation, while others suddenly recalled pressing business elsewhere and slipped away to a safe distance. Elminster yawned. "Put away thy blade," he said softly to Storm. Then he said more loudly and most merrily, "It appears boastful striplings will come to mage fairs for no greater purpose than to insult their betters." The old mage sighed theatrically and went on. "I suppose, Cockerel, that now ye've picked a quarrel and will challenge me, eh?" "Nay, nay, that's not fair. After all, I've the wisdom of ages with which to make the right choices, whereas ye have only the hot vigor of youth. Pretty phrase that. So I'll even the odds a trifle. I'll challenge thee. Fireball throwing, eh? What say ye?" A cheer arose. The red-faced mage waited for it to die, then said scornfully, "A sport for children, and I suppose old lackwits." Elminster smiled, very like a cat gloating over cornered prey, and said, "Perhaps. On the other hand, perhaps ye are frightened of losing." Mage's face grew redder still. He cast a look around at the interested watching faces and snapped, "I accept." Then he struck an ostentatious pose and vanished. An instant later, amid a puff of scarlet smoke, he reappeared on the edge of the gorge and made an insulting gesture at the old mage from afar. Elminster chuckled, waved a lazy hand in reply, and climbed clumsily back up onto his long-suffering horse. Storm saw him salute Duara with a wink. Then Duara's eyes met her own, and Storm could read the silent plea in them as clearly as if the young sorceress had shouted it in her ear. "Look after him, lady, please." By the time they had ridden up and out of the valley to the meadows beyond, many wizards had gathered to watch. Haughty young sorcerers had been hurling fire about all day, but the expectant silence hanging over the scene seemed to indicate that the mage with the red staff had won a reputation at the fair, or many elders remembered Elminster, or perhaps even both. With more haste than grace, Elminster fell from his saddle. He hit the ground at a stumbling run, staggered to a halt, and dusted himself off. Then he saw his waiting opponent, and with obvious pleasant surprise said, "Well, lead off, boy." "One side, old man," said the young mage darkly, waving his staff. "Or have you no fear of dying in a ball of flame?" Elminster stroked his beard. "Yes, yes," he said eagerly, his mind seemingly far away. "Well, I do remember. Oh, those were the days. Great bursts of fire in the sky." The young mage pushed past him. "Now, how did that one go, eh? Oh, my eyes, I think I recall." Elminster burbled on, voice thick and eyes far away. Contemptuously the young mage set his staff in the crook of his arm, muttered his incantation in low tones so the old mage could not hear, and moved his hands in the deftly gliding gestures of the spell. An instant later, above the grassy meadow, fire grew from nothingness into a great red-violet sphere. It seethed and roiled, rolled over once, and burst in orange ruin over the meadow, raining down small teardrops of flame onto the grass. Heat smoked the watchers' faces, and the ground rocked briefly. As the roaring died away, the quavering voice of the old mage could still be heard, murmuring about the triumphs of yesteryear. He broke off his chatter for a moment to say mildly, "Dear me, that's a gentle one. Can't you do better than that?" The young mage sneered. "I suppose you can." Elminster nodded calmly. "Oh, yes." "Would it be possible to see thee perform this awesome feat?" the mage inquired with acidic courtliness, his voice a mocking, over-pompous parody of Elminster's own thickened tones. The old mage blinked. "Young man," he said disapprovingly, "the great mastery of magic lies in knowing when not to use the power, else all these lands would long ago have become a smoking ruin." The young mage sneered again. "So you won't perform such a trifling spell for us, almightiest of mages? Is that the way of it?" "No, no," Elminster said with a sigh. "We did agree, and ye have done thy little bit, so I," he sighed again, "shall do mine." He gestured vaguely, then paused and harumphed. "Ah, now," he said, "how does that rhyme go?" There were a few titters from the watching crowd as he scratched his beard and looked around with a puzzled air. The young mage sneered at his back and then turned to favor Storm with the same disdain. The bard, who stood close by, hand on the hilt of her sword, met his gaze with a wintry look of her own. Elminster suddenly drew himself up and shouted, "By tongue of bat and sulphur's reek, and mystic words I now do speak, there, where I wish to play my game, let empty air burst into flame." In answer, the very air seemed to shatter with an ear-splitting shriek. A gigantic ball of flame suddenly towered over the meadow, its heat blistering the watchers' faces. It was as if the sun had fallen. As mages cried out and shaded their eyes, the fireball rolled away from the awed crowd for a trembling instant, then burst in a blinding white flash, hurling out its mighty energies in a long jet of flame that roared away to the horizon. The earth shook and seemed to leap upward, throwing all but the old mage to their knees. When the shaking had died away, Storm found herself lying beside the horses on the turf. By the time she had struggled to her feet and shook her head clear, the roiling smoke had died away, and everyone could see what Elminster's magic had wrought on the meadow. Or rather, what had been the meadow, where a broad expanse of flame-scorched grass had stretched a moment before. A smoking crater now yawned, large and deep and very impressive. Nice, isn't it?" Elminster said rather vaguely. "I'd forgotten how much fun hurling fire is. How does that spell go again?" This time the old mage merely waved a finger. His young opponent, clinging to a red metal staff, now battered and bent in 6 places, was just getting to his knees when another ball of flame, as big as the first, roared over the meadow. That was enough to send him tumbling again, and the young mage soon found himself atop a dazed and rotund Kalashite sorcerer. When he could see clearly again, the mage saw a second crater smoking in the distance. Awed murmuring could be heard from the watching wizards all around. "Now," Elminster said mildly, drawing the stunned young mage to his feet with a firm hand, "was there aught else you wanted to speak of? Sending and such or prismatic spheres pretty, aren't they? I've always enjoyed them. Or crafting artifacts, say? No? Ah, well then, fare thee well in thy art, young master of the cutting tongue, and learn a trifle more wisdom too, if ye've the wits to do so. Until next we meet." Elminster patted the young mage's arm cheerily, snapped his fingers, and vanished. A moment later he reappeared beside an anxious Storm. "Mount up," he said cheerily. "We've realms to cross tonight." "Realms?" asked Storm. As they rode up the ridge and left the mage fair behind, she did not look back. "I thought you had to get a key, or was it the twig? Did that mage take the key from you?" "Oh, no," replied Elminster merrily. He rode close and touched her forearm. Abruptly the landscape was gone, replaced momentarily by shifting, shadowy grayness. The travelers seemed to be standing on nothing, but the horses trotted as if it were solid ground. Even before Storm could gasp a breath, there was another jolt, and they were somewhere else again, a place of darkness where rocks of all sizes crashed together endlessly, tumbling and rebounding as they hurtled through the emptiness. There was a constant thunder of stone smashing into stone, the scene lit by flashes of phosphorescence from each violent impact. Storm took one look at the scene and tore her weathered cloak from behind her saddle, flinging it over the head of her mount to prevent its rearing and plunging forward off the rather small area of rock they'd appeared on. The old mage's mount stood calm, controlled by his magic, no doubt. Storm stared around at the endless destruction and found herself ducking low, as a large jagged boulder thundered towards them. It was easily as large as 4 horses and tumbled end over end as it came at them. Elminster gestured unconcernedly, and the boulder veered off to strike another larger rock nearby. A deafening crash filled the air, and a shower of stone chips rained down upon the bard. Storm shook her head. Whatever this place was, they were no longer in Faerun. The green-clad dolt thought he had taken our prize, the old mage continued casually. He suspected Duara might pass me the key, but he's found by now that his mighty staff is indeed just a twig. Now he'll have to go on watching her for the rest of the mage fair, trying to see if she passes the key on to someone else, and for all he knows, anyone might be me, just wearing another shape. Duara lead him a merry dance. She likes hugging young men and all that, he chuckled. Shining schemes often come to naught, you know. Boulders rolled and crashed right in front of them. Storm bit her lip to quell an involuntary shriek, shielded her eyes against flying stone shards, and asked, Duara, you got the key from her, didn't you? I saw her hands at your belt. Elminster nodded. Aye, she gave it to me. All 3 of our foes at the fair saw it too, the 2 who challenged me, and 1 who did not dare come forward. He fended off 6 small stones hurtling toward them. The 3rd mage was there only to watch what transpired, no doubt, and report where we went. I used magic to blind him and the young master of fire hurling, too, under cover of my fire spear blast. They're both fortunate mage fair rules prohibit spells that enfeeble the wits, or they'd be staring at nothing for a long time indeed. The blindness will wear off soon enough, but they'll find us safely gone, and the key with us. What and where is this key? Storm asked patiently, reaching into a saddlebag for some cheese. Why did they not know where you'd hidden it? They saw, but they did not see, the old mage replied, using magic to float the cheese she held out deftly to his mouth. They knew not that Duara and I were old friends, or how quick her wits are. He reached into his mouth and drew out a small spindle of metal set with a large emerald. The key, he said grandly, his voice suddenly into casual, clear-edged, fussy self again. It's been in there since Duara first kissed me. He licked his lips considerately and added, She still likes almonds. The waiting cheese slid into his mouth. He chewed, made an approving face, and took Storm's hand. Around them at his will, the world shifted again. In the blink of an eye, the darkness and crashing rocks were gone. Now their horses stood on a crumbling stone bridge in the midst of a fetid swamp, ringed by vine-hung trees. Slimy stone statues protruded from the still black waters on all sides. Storm could see they perched on a raised avenue, part of an ancient city that lay drowned in the mire around them. As Storm glanced behind her, several glistening black tentacles rose lazily from the inky waters and rolled in languid curls across the stone span. After these questing limbs bobbed and swayed, almost as if they sniffed the air, they slid slowly into the water again. The bard pointed to a trail of ripples, which seemed to mark the path of something large moving toward them just under the water's surface. Elminster nodded, smiled, and waved a hand, casually, and they were somewhere else again. This time the horses were on an old sunken road in the heart of a dark forest. Storm sighed. The Harpers wanted me to protect you, she began to ask, but when she spied the dull glint of many eyes watching them from dim, shadowed places under the trees, Storm reached for her sword. Elminster grunted and pitched himself heavily from his saddle. Then he reached up and laid gentle fingers on the wrist of her own arm. "Nay," he said softly, "'tis more likely, far, that they wanted ye to protect others from me." Storm rolled her eyes. Smoothly she swung herself down from her saddle. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "Key or no key, this hopping from place to place, world to world, is neither safe nor wise." Elminster grinned. "And coming to the Mage Fair with me was? I've taken us this way home, jumping so often, to give the slip to any mages who might have followed us. Few have the breadth of mind to shift from one world to another as often as we have." The old mage patted her arm. "Thanks for thy patience, lass. 'Tis not long now before we'll be at ease and ye can chat with a good friend." As Elminster led the way on foot down an uneven path through the trees, bright morning dawned upon the old unfamiliar forest. The rosy light seemed to make the old mage recall something. He turned and gestured behind them. Storm looked back in time to see their horses vanish. She looked at Elminster. He answered her wordless question only with a merry grin and headed back down the path again. Holding her tongue, Storm followed, and she drew her sword, despite the old mage's words. Knowing Elminster, this friend could be a blue dragon, or worse. The path led between two old, moss-covered stones. As they drew near, Elminster reached back and took Storm's hand. They stepped between the stones together, and the bard felt an old, tingling chill. They were somewhere else again, somewhere familiar. Storm knew almost at once that she was in Shadow Dale. Elminster let go of her hand and strode away, reaching into his robes for his pipe. Storm stood staring after him for a moment. Then in two quick strides she caught up to him. Setting a firm hand on his shoulder, the bard spun Elminster around. "Not a step further," she warned. "Not until you tell me just what's going on. Where are our horses? Why'd we have to ride across half of Faerun for the key anyway? Can't this dwarf teleport? And what?" Elminster laid a finger over her mouth and said, "The need for haste is past. I doubt anyone could have followed us through all the places I took us not yet. Our mounts have preceded us to the Twisted Tower stables. Come to my home. There you'll meet a friend for us both, Leo." The old mage lit his pipe and said not a word more until they were strolling up the flagstone path to the door of his ramshackle stone tower. It opened at his approach, and he turned and said, "Put away thy blade, Storm, and be welcome." As they went in, the scribe Leo called from the kitchen, "Tea, shortly, old one." "For Storm too," Elminster said softly. By some trick of magic, Leo heard his master and called out, "Welcome, Lady Bard." "Hello, Leo," Storm replied, looking at the old mage with amusement. Elminster was calmly shoving piles of papers onto the floor, emptying a chair for her to sit in. Dust curled up his thick tendrils. Muttering, he gestured and it was gone. "A mite dark in here for me to see a beautiful lady guest," the old mage murmured, then reached out to touch a brass brazier. He made a popping sound, and flames flared up, casting a warm dancing glow on the chair. Elminster gestured with courtly grace, indicating that Storm should sit down. The bard stared at the brazier in puzzlement. "How does it burn without any fuel?" "Magic, of course." Elminster turned away, raising yet another dust cloud on his foray through more piles of parchment. Of course. Storm reached out and tapped his shoulder. Elmnister, she said coldly, talk. Her tone held a sudden ring of steel. The old mage seated himself calmly on thin air, puffed on his pipe, and grinned at her through the rising smoke. Ye deserve to know, lass. Right then. Duara was briefly an apprentice of mine. She dwells in Telflam these days, and joined the Harpers a summer back. He puffed his pipe, and a blue-green smoke ring rose slowly up until the low-ceilinged gloomed overhead. She can't use a teleport spell because she hasn't the power yet. Like all young over-eager mages, she took the adventuring to gain magic quickly, and unlike most magelings, came across a dragon horde. Another smoke ring rose up from the pipe. The old mage watched its drifting journey, nodded approvingly, and went on. The horde had a dragon attached to it, of course, but that's another tale. Among the baubles she found my key, so she sent word to me by caravan letter that she had it and would bring it to the mage fair if I was interested. Who are your mysterious foes, then? How did you lose the key? Storm asked. And why was Duara so dim as to send open word to you? Elmnister shrugged. She'd no idea anyone save me would be interested in the key or even know what her letter was about. When I got her note, I used magic to far-speak with her, telling her I'd be coming to the fair. She told me that once sending the letter, she'd been attacked several times, twice found her tower ransacked, and even been threatened one night in her bedchamber by a mysterious whispering voice demanding the key. Storm rolled her eyes. So what is this key? The key to this closet, of course, Elmnister said calmly, reaching out a long arm into the dusty gloom behind him. The key gleamed in his hand as it slipped through a slyly smiling dragon head carved into the wall. Lines appeared in the stone around the very small carving, outlining a door. It began to swing open by itself. Elmnister pulled the key out and waved it at her. This was stolen from me by an unscrupulous man long ago who was very briefly, mind ye, my apprentice. He was an ambitious Kalashite, I recall, named Raylan. I suppose he ended up in the jaws of Duara's dragon. Well, what do you keep in there that mages chase after the key? Storm asked, looking at the closet's dusty door. Old spell books, picked up over the years while wandering the world, Elmnister replied as the door swung wide. Storm saw an untidy pile of thick moldering tomes. Eerie green and white light flashed suddenly from behind her. As it lit up the old mage's face, Storm saw his look of surprise and whirled around, upsetting her chair. The eerie light came from a flickering oval flame. It hung upright in the air, in the middle of the tiny, cramped room. Its presence defied the mighty magics that guarded Elmnister's tower, magics Storm knew that kept the place safe from the archmages of the evil Gentarim, the red wizards of Thay, and worse. No one should have been able to open a gate into the tower. But the oval of flame was, Storm decided, most certainly a gate. When the bard looked through the flickering magical doorway, she saw a long stone-lined hall stretching away into the darkness, and something was moving in a gloomy passageway. Elmnister strode forward, frowning, hands weaving spells out of the air. "Impossible," he murmured. A shadowy figure was walking slowly towards them, out of the darkness of that phantom hallway. The creature was tall and very thin. Its eyes, too, were cold, glittering points of light set in dark pits. As it came nearer, Storm could see that the robes it wore hung in tatters, eaten away by rot.